Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Happy Cynics. We thought we would just pick up and continue talking about apocalypticism. Specifically, we thought we'd look at the Christian apocalypse, or say the revelation of John, and put that in its context. There have been a number of interpretations of this throughout Christian history, but evangelicalism seems to predominantly reflects what became known as dispensationalism, which arose in the 1800s. So let's just kind of very quickly recap. So here's the thing. The revelation of John, New Testament authors often would appeal to the Old Testament prophets because that was a big part of their agenda, was showing that Jesus is the Messiah. So let me say this. Jewish people historically, although there have been some that became convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, of course that's how Christianity got started. But most Jewish people don't accept Jesus as a Messiah because he didn't do all the Messiah stuff. Reign on the throne of David. So the Messiah, what was the promise about the Messiah? The Messiah was going to come. Israel had gone through this whole period of history, or through most of its history, but up to this time, of exile, returning to Palestine, exile, and diaspora being scattered out. Well, they also had this up and down period of judges. After they settled in Canaan, then you had the monarchy, the united monarchy, then the divided monarchy between the north and the south, which we talked about. Then you have exile, and then they return, and then they just have basically a Herod, puppet leader under the Roman government. So this is the background, and the prophecy is going to be from these exilic prophets, that God is going to send a final deliverer, and then Israel will be restored to its rightful place of dominance in the world because of God's covenant with Abraham. And they would return to Palestine or Zion and the Messiah will reestablish the temple, and everything will be kosher from there on out. And so they're looking for this final deliverer. Christians are those that said, well, Jesus is this Messiah. But the response was, well, he's not, he didn't take over the government. He's not ruling on the throne of David. And in fact, his own disciples were expecting him to. And then they were surprised when he just gave himself up to the authorities. And so this has always been a part of Christianity, that Jesus has to come back. And why does Jesus have to come back? Because he didn't fulfill everything the first time. So part of the Christian belief has always been Jesus isn't done yet. Okay, yes, he is the Messiah, but he did mostly the suffering servant stuff and some of the Messiah stuff, like he fulfilled, all the stuff about being born in Bethlehem. And, so the gospel writers are going out of their way to explain how Jesus fulfills all these prophecies. But then, of course, it's left. Is he going to come back and deliver Israel, reign on the throne of David? Well, then that's where the revelation of John comes in. This is the Christian response. Yes, Jesus is going to come back. The book is written by somebody claiming to be John. Yes, I know a lot of folks want to believe it was written by St. John. That's very difficult to defend. That probably is the latest book written in the New Testament that I know of. Is the revelation of John, or the apocalypse. But basically, you have a commentary on the events that took place following Jesus' resurrection, with the fall of the temple, again, in the year 70 AD. And the story seems to focus on this, expecting that these events were going to precipitate Jesus returning at any time. You had that same kind of feeling at the end of the Gospels, where they're even asking Jesus, who's going to be alive? How many of us will still be alive when you come back? Okay. And then he says, there'll be some here who won't taste of death. Well, then Christians have said, oh, well, that's John. John is the youngest, and John must be the one who's going to see it. Well, then when Jesus didn't come back, then the Christian response was, oh, well, John saw it, but we just misunderstood. He saw it as a future vision. He didn't see it in his own lifetime, but in his lifetime, he did see in a vision what was going to happen in the end times. Now, this is why that's another reason why Christians have, and I'm going to pause and shut up and let you respond or add what you want to add here, Isaac. But in my opinion, this is why Christians have had this knack for wanting to interpret Revelation as being about events that are going to happen when Jesus does return to earth a second time. But that's because, in my opinion, okay, right or wrong here, and I don't know who really knows, but it kind of seems to me that the author believes that with the fall of the temple again, that this is going to be the event that kicks off. You already had Pentecost, and Peter announced that we're now living in the last days because that was prophesied by Joel, that in the last days I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. And so all these people receiving the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, having tongues of fire over their heads, and then even the Gentiles were receiving this. So this was an indication that God is pulling out all the stops, so to speak, and God's not holding any resources back. He sent the Holy Spirit out now to bring people to Jesus, and it was a sense of urgency by these early Christians that in our lifetimes, Jesus is going to come back. So I have no doubt whatsoever that the author of the Revelation of John did believe that these are events that are surrounding Jesus' return, but they're also events that happened in the first century. Because I believe this author really believed that he would live to see Jesus come back here as this plays out. It's not really until you get several centuries later and people are like, okay, well, Jesus hasn't come back. All these events are over. Now, what do we do with this? Well, for a long time, this just basically, it just kind of got left by the wayside. Like nobody really worried about it. And they kind of interpreted, I think, in that context, well, this was the early Christians believing Jesus was going to return in their lifetime. Jesus is going to come back. But these events were, obviously, it was talking about things in the first century. That context is past. So we don't really do much. They didn't really do a whole lot with the book until the development of American pop folk theology in the 1800s. Okay, now I'm going to come up for air here, Isaac.
Yeah, so I think you've left us off at a good place. So last time we touched on very briefly the development of dispensationalism.
Yes.
I don't know if we actually mentioned Darby by name.
No.
Is it Charles Darby, right? Charles, his first name?
Charles or William?
It's not that important, but a theologian named Darby.
It is Darby, yes.
Came up with this idea that there would be these dispensations in history that sort of mirror the creation of Earth.
John Nelson Darby.
John Darby.
Yeah, we were both wrong.
And this isn't he's not the first person to articulate this, but he's sort of the person who puts it in its modern form.
Right.
So there are these dispensations. We're in the sixth dispensation, which is the dispensation of the church. Mm-hmm. And they reflect the creation of the world in Genesis.
Right.
And that the seventh dispensation is what the book of Revelation is sort of prophesying about. And that seventh dispensation will be the millennial rule of Jesus over all of the earth.
Yeah, I've even heard, so dispensationalism was also used to justify the teaching of a rapture. Okay.
Yeah, so that's the next thing he kind of contributed that's in the modern pop consciousness.
Right. So Augustine, St. Augustine, basically talked about you have different periods of history and God has dealt differently with human beings. So you basically have and some of the Christian thinkers have divided this up differently. So, for example, they might say from Adam up to Noah's flood, God dealt with humanity one way. And then after the flood, God made this covenant with Noah. He wouldn't destroy the earth again. You have that all the way up to Abraham. And then you have from Abraham to Moses with the receiving of the law. And then the law goes all the way up. This is a Christian interpretation, obviously.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So then from the law, that goes all the way, I believe, up to Jesus. And then you go from like the age of law to the age of grace. So they have like names for these, like one of them's, covenant or promise, and the other is like the dispensation of conscience or whatever, and
right,
that sort of thing. So then you have the age of grace or the church. Okay, so then this is where, like with Pentecost, then God's dealing with humanity now in a different way again. The thing is that there is this progression through the Christian scriptures that God becomes more and more like increasingly accessible over time. And as religion becomes less of a community thing and becomes more and more personal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now dispensationalists kind of pick up on this. And so the idea of the rapture for those of you, it'd be kind of hard to believe, I'm sure there's people that don't know about this, but this dispensationalism or the rapture, this is what's depicted, say, like in these Left Behind videos.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so before the 1800s, there's a passage where Paul talks about Christ appearing in the clouds. Okay, well, that was all interpreted as being a part of Christ returning to earth. Because even Jesus himself, like, talked about his return being like a thief in the night. Okay, there's going to be two grinding at the mill. One of them's going to be taken. The other's going to be left behind.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then, see, this in conjunction with Paul talking about Jesus appearing in the clouds, well, then people started putting this together into like a separate doctrine where Jesus comes back in two stages. So Jesus just doesn't come back, and this is all part of Jesus' return. And maybe, let me say this, maybe rightfully so, because maybe Paul's depiction of Jesus' return isn't exactly the same as the way the gospel writers talk about Jesus' return.
Right.
And I know a lot of dispensationalists or people that buy into this. See, that's what ends up happening. You end up having these doctrines because there are conflicts within the text or tensions. I won't say necessarily conflicts, but again, the whole thing in John, there's no like Jesus sneaking up on anybody. He like comes out of heaven on a white horse and comes down with like an army of angels and destroys the Antichrist and then reigns. Okay. Mm-hmm. So there's no sneaking up on anybody. See, that's the problem. So the interpretation of 1 Thessalonians where Jesus appears in the clouds, that is easier to reconcile with a doctrine of, Jesus appears in the clouds, takes the Christians out, and then he'll come back to earth. You only have, that's easy to reconcile with the Gospels where Jesus is talking about, I'm going to come like a thief in the night, catch people off guard and catch them unaware. Okay. And there's going to be two, one's going to disappear. That seems to coincide. Okay. But when you look at even the people that try to do all this fancy footwork to make it all fit together, you cannot reconcile, in my opinion. There's no place in Revelation that suggests anything like a rapture at all. The revelation of John has no rapture in it whatsoever. Okay? The only place, and even back to my days of when I pastored, I don't know if it was a mistake or not, but I decided in order to generate interest in the weekly Bible studies, we'd have midweek Bible studies. I passed out papers and told people to write down like 3 books of the Bible they'd be interested in doing a Bible study on. Well, when I counted the votes, the top vote getter was Revelation, and the second vote getter was the Book of Daniel. So,
wow, very apocalyptic.
Yeah. So, yeah, everybody wanted to know about the end of time. So, anyway, I ended up spending like 18 months, the first 18 months, just going through those books and reading all kinds of different commentaries and such. And that's kind of my background on this. It kind of forced me into getting into some of these different views. But see, that's the thing. The only place that I've ever seen, okay, for those of you that are familiar with the text, it's like I heard a voice from heaven saying, come up here and blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh, well, that's the rapture. Well, that's not the rapture. That's just John being called up to heaven so he could have this vision and see what's going to happen. And so there is nothing like a rapture in the book of Revelation.
Well, but I think part of the strength in the appeal of that position is that the people who read the Bible through this lens sort of see themselves like decoding a secret, you know, like piecing together all these different prophecies that God has given us so that we can sort of decode them and perceive this like secret knowledge. It's got a sort of Gnostic element to it.
Yeah. Yeah. In kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say bibliolatrous, but, in other words, it's like only the people that are, say, fundamentalist about the text are going to be able to read the hidden meanings and such.
Right. Well, and it also gives the fundamentalist reading of the text a very convenient tool for explaining some of the conflicts in the text of like, well, that was a different dispensation.
Right.
That was a different, you know, that's why there's all these differences in the theology of the text.
Well, and that's also been a part of this too. So I know we haven't talked about the historic roots of it, and we can talk about that. Maybe we don't even need to make that a special point. But this was another thing. So if you listen to all these folks that get into all this dispensational stuff, so I don't know, Hal Lindsey, John Hagee, I don't know, pretty much any evangelical, you know, they'll kind of get into this stuff. They'll all say that, okay, once the rapture takes place, that the Holy Spirit's taken out of the world. And so the people that are left behind, there's like no hope. You're going to end up getting the mark of the beast and burn in hell forever. It's like hopeless. Well, again, there's nothing in the text that says anything about the Holy Spirit being taken out of the world. That is all, I'm sorry, but it's all fabricated by these people, by these thinkers, to make it fit their doctrine. Like I said, the doctrine fits very well with 1 Thessalonians and what Jesus talks about in the Gospels. But it does not fit with the revelation of John. That is giving a different scenario. Now, I know just like we have people who don't want to accept that there are two creation narratives in Genesis, but they're two separate stories. I mean, this was a part of Jewish scripture and the rabbinic tradition. It was always dialogical. You even see this, say, in the Christian Old Testament. You know, the Hebrew scriptures that we use in our Bible. You see this where even whenever like prophets were being summoned, they would often summon more than one prophet, get more than one opinion. And so one prophet would give a favorable say, oh, yes, you should do it, king. And the other one says, no, God's bringing judgment. You need to accept it humbly, etc. You have this kind of going on. And so there are these tensions where they have disagreements, and then they're learning by dialoguing over these disagreements.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And you see some of that in the New Testament too. So there's obvious tensions between the way Peter views the law and the way Paul views it. Okay. Just like we talked about before, how there's tension between like the book of Romans and the book of James, you know, on the role of works and things like that. So it's not surprising to me that the revelation of John, is giving a somewhat different account of the return of Jesus than what you get in the Gospels or from Paul's writings.
Well, I think there's another conflict present in the text, especially on this issue, because the apocalyptic sort of reading of the text has been used to justify a particular interpretation of history. And that's what it's designed to do, right? That's what that literature is for, is interpretation of all of human history.
Yes.
However, the tension that is present when you do that is the tension with material reality. Like, for instance, Paul predicts very explicitly that people in whatever church he was writing to were going to be alive when the apocalypse happens.
Yeah.
And that's just not physically real.
Right.
So you have to say he was wrong about that.
Well, I tend to lean towards the view, right or wrong, again, that the author of the apocalypse actually, was writing about things that were going on and had gone on in the past century or so, and was writing, basically surmising how he thought everything was going to play out. I really do think that that's what he thought. Now, whether he saw that coming down the road or pretty quickly, I don't think it was. I don't know. I've read different dates. Some people trying to remember how they date the apocalypse. I don't think there's anybody puts it hardly in the first century. It's like early second century sometime.
Yeah, my preferred date for the book, and this is like a whole discussion amongst biblical scholars, but I tend to interpret the book as during the reign of Diocletian.
Okay.
Because it makes reference to the Diocletian Games.
Okay. I'm trying to remember the year is Diocletian. So was that...
He's like 4 emperors post Nero. So it would be
about 150,
2nd century.
About 150, 170? Yeah. That's what I was thinking too. It was somewhere in the middle of the 2nd century. Yeah, so I mean, I believe that, there probably is, there are those references that are kind of telling about most likely when it was written. That's what biblical scholars go from, this internal evidence that's in the text itself. Sometimes authors refer to things that couldn't have been known in the apostles' own lifetime.
Okay, so I misspoke. Who I meant was Domitian. I always get Diocletian and Domitian mixed up. Domitian was emperor from the year 51 to the year 96.
Oh, yeah. Diocletian is the guy who was emperor shortly before Constantine took it over. He's the one divided into quadrants, I believe.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Domitian. Yes.
Domitian.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the end of the 1st century.
Right. Got it. Okay. Well, that makes sense. Like turn of the 2nd century. Okay.
Right.
All right. I can live. I mean, I don't really care. I don't really have a stake in how early or how late it was. I would think it wouldn't be that much later than the destruction of the temple, because that, again, is the catalyst that kind of starts everything going.
So Domitian takes the throne 10 years after the destruction of the temple.
Okay. So about
in the year 81.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right. That makes sense. Well, so what you have, and I'll say this as well, the thing that the whole rapture and dispensationalism, the reason that was appealing to people was kind of twofold. Now, remember, I had alluded back to saying about how there had been theologians like down through like the Middle Ages and whatever speculated, well, maybe since the earth was created in 4004 BC, the whole history of the earth will parallel the 7 days of creation. So you'd have 6,000 years and then 1,000-year millennium at the end for the Sabbath. See? So because of that, there were people that were really worried that around the year 2000, Jesus would have to come back before the year 2000. Because that would be like 6,000 years of earth history.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why that was such a big deal. When they started getting in the 1800s, they figured, after the American Revolution, everything, it was in the frontier movement. So as Christianity is moving into the Western frontier, which is, the Bible Belt today, that's where all this stuff really starts to take root. And so you have, I'm going to add a little bit of context too, because you got to remember it was around this same time period that gave rise to Mormonism, and then later the Adventist movement, which gave rise to the Jehovah's Witnesses. You had Christian Science with Mary Baker Eddy. Other movements, you had the whole holiness camp meeting movement going on. So there was all kinds of interest and renewed interest in Christianity. And here's the thing. There's this renewed sense of urgency because now we're getting closer and closer to the year 2000.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Christianity. It was just mysticism in general was big.
Yes. Yeah, well, and that's another part of it too, because the 19th century is, in the West, we characterize that as the Romantic period. Because this was the backlash against the kind of cool rationalism of the Enlightenment, which pretty much dominated in the 18th century, that everybody needs to suppress their feelings and try to be objective and reasonable. And people got tired of trying to do that. And it's just kind of like it went from the Scholastic period into the Renaissance. Same thing happens here from the Enlightenment into the Romantic period. It's an emphasis on feelings and free expression. And so you had musicians like Beethoven and others that start not only using dominant sevenths in music, they start using diminished sevenths and other kinds of chord progressions and, music that had been deemed evil in the Baroque period was now being embraced and felt and experienced. And you start having the emergence of abstract art. People are starting to go beyond the boundaries. And the same thing happens in religion. The emphasis is not anymore on orthodoxy. So Christianity goes from a sacramental understanding of salvation, that you get sacraments through mystically, like God is present mystically through the elements that you receive, the sacraments. And then in the Protestant Reformation, it kind of went to a combination of both a creedal, conversionistic, you have your own conversion, but then that reflects in you embracing orthodoxy, because we talked about that before. But then over time, and this is where John Wesley was kind of a precursor to some of these 1800s people, emphasizing feelings, that no, it's about feelings. Are you full of love for God and others? And then you had Schleiermacher saying the same thing in Germany in 1820, although in a much more abstract way. But, and then this ripples over into America, and you end up with a lot of emotion, a lot of feeling. You had in the 1800s, so even some of the background with the emergence of Mormonism, there were people claiming that we talk about conspiracy theories today, but they were rampant in the early 1800s. There were people claiming that there was a lost tribe of Israel that had been wiped out of history, and everybody was trying to find out who this lost tribe of Israel was. So the Book of Mormon claims it's the Native Americans, like the Incas and some of them, that they're somehow Jews. Well, that's all been debunked through genetic testing and things like that now. But there's that. There was, again, trying to predict Jesus, when Jesus is going to come back. That was another thing. There were all these other, there was a lost this and a lost that, and now we've found it. Okay. And so it was just a lot of, I don't want to say gimmicks, but a lot of stuff to capture people's attention. You had faith healers. You had the emergence of faith healers. And not only the religious faith healers, you had snake oil salesmen. They were out there going around with their wagons out in the West, telling people if you just, put snake oil or drink snake oil or whatever, then it'll cure this, or bee pollen or whatever else it may be, some herb or,
Well, it's interesting. I think there might be some medical history that maybe played into this too, because this was a time when people were being prescribed stuff like cocaine and arsenic and lead and
right. And we end up with Coca-Cola.
Right. Well, and it's also a time period where people are basically drinking alcohol exclusively.
Yeah.
Throughout the day. Like they'd wake up and their first thing would be beer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a lot of chemicals going on.
Right. Yeah. And, so this is kind of all the backdrop of what's going on. So, and I personally think, with all the unrest, and here again, you have a civil war that takes place in the United States. This, it's kind of percolating over several decades, before if it finally comes to a head with the election of Abraham Lincoln. And there are still to this day people that claim that even though Lincoln won the general election fairly, that the newly formed Republican Party rigged the primary so that Lincoln would be the delegate or the candidate for president. That they had railroaded him through because they wanted an abolitionist candidate.
Well, before the Civil War broke out, Abraham Lincoln wasn't really an abolitionist.
Oh, yeah. Well,
he was an abolitionist personally, but not in his political discourse.
It wasn't like his cause célèbre.
Yeah, and he never made any political moves before the secession of the Southern states on the abolition of slavery.
Right.
So there's a lot of interesting history going on in the time that these views are.
Right.
It's a lot of turmoil in society.
Yes, and this made the times seem apocalyptic. And whenever the times became apocalyptic, then they were looking for some kind of a theology that was going to tell them, oh, don't worry, if it's not going to get too bad, like if it starts getting worse, in fact, don't be discouraged, be encouraged, because it's got to get worse before Jesus can come back. And then Jesus is going to come back and take all the Christians out. And so the Christians aren't going to have to go. So if things are getting worse, then just hang in there, because then we're really close. And so this was a way of keeping people motivated, but at the same time, it fed into the whole, I don't think this is just, let's put it this way. These people that are dispensationalists are predominantly under Anabaptist influence.
Right.
Now, Anabaptism is not just about, the illegitimacy of infant baptism, but Anabaptists are also separatists. So you have this, it's pretty obvious, like with your Amish and then your stricter Mennonites and Church of the Brethren and such. But even all the way down to the rest of the evangelical ranks, you have evangelicals. I think one of the characteristics of evangelicals is this belief that somehow Christians have to be different than everybody else. That's the degree of separatism. So it's like if everybody else is listening to this kind of music, we got to have a Christian equivalent of it. If everybody is doing this, we have to have a Christian version of it. Okay? Ours has got to be different than theirs, because the church has to be different. Now, see, this is where this kind of a theology fit right in with this crowd, because you don't have to get in there and try to change the world or save it. In fact, just let it keep sliding down, because then we're just looking for Jesus to come back even that much quicker. And so, we're going to talk about this coming up with climate change. But see, the same thing is true. Like, people that embrace these views, there's a correlation between people that hold these kind of views and people who ignore climate change as a real danger. And that's not just coincidental.
Well, I think there's a broader pattern there. and not to be too Marxist, but that religion sort of gets used as a way of pacifying real material concerns of daily life. So with like the early dispensationalist movements, you're talking about an American, mostly rural, but pre-labor movement.
Right.
Where America is dominated by capital.
Right.
And not just in like the city manufacturing zone, but like farmers are basically tenants across the United States. Most people don't own anything.
Right.
Right. So even in these like really rural places,
sharecroppers.
Yeah, they're sharecroppers. They're poor tenant farmers, and people are food prices are down and rent is up. So a lot of these people who are on the frontier, especially, are on the frontier because they've been kicked off their land.
Right. Right.
And there's not a lot of hope for them in the material plane in terms of their subsistence going forward. And religion is often used as a sort of like, I think it's intuitive, I think it's natural to sort of, what's the word? Displace hope into a future period.
Yes.
I think you see the same thing now with our current problems like climate change.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And other like big issues in the world today, like we're going to talk about nuclear proliferation. We're going to talk about climate change. We might talk about democracy and its coming trials.
Yeah, okay, so I don't want to downplay the perils that and the dangers that the frontier people faced. Okay, I don't want to do that. But you can see where this kind of interpretation does kind of invite almost like it's an opportunity to wash your hands of responsibility for the whole thing. And it's like, because we're actually the victims. Okay. We're the victims. We're the ones that, are losing. And see this triumphalism that comes through in the Revelation. I mean, in Revelation, Jesus comes down and then he basically, kicks butts and then sets up his reign. And so, hey, it's all good. And so it's like Jesus coming down to, this is the thing, like the 100. So in the text, you're familiar, but for the audience here, there's 144,000 that are sealed. So in other words, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. So the author here is saying, okay, even though we're Christians, is that Jesus, when Jesus comes down, God doesn't forget his covenant with Abraham. So God keeps the Antichrist from destroying all the Jews. There's at least a remnant that's left. They're called the remnant. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that goes back to Old Testament prophecies as well. So during the exilic period, God's going to preserve a remnant. So there's going to be at least a group of people to start, to work from. Like everybody won't pass away. And I think that may have been also a part of the discussion, or at least the context of the discussion with the disciples and Jesus. Is there anybody still going to be left here when you come back? But there's going to be this remnant that's left. So there's this kind of continuity. But a lot of Christians then later, inserted themselves, like, there was different interpretations. So before the rapture, it's like, oh, well, maybe we're part of this 144,000. So Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, reinterpret that those are 144,000 Jehovah's Witnesses. Yeah, I don't know where you get that. But nevertheless, that's where they come from. The dispensationalists, okay, well then that allows them to say, oh no, those are Jews, because they have to go through the tribulation period. We don't, because we're going to be taken out. Well, there's all different kinds of stuff. I mean, the symbolism, yes, there's the Antichrist, but the symbolism, and this is what's kind of funny, I mean, it isn't funny. I mean, it is in a certain way. It's kind of sad in other ways, but we mentioned this last time about so many references to, say, the Roman emperors. Um, and one of the people that gets really singled out was Nero, even though Nero died a couple years before the temple got leveled. But Nero basically scapegoated Christians for a lot of things that happened. Like when Rome caught on fire, he blamed Christians for it. And then he persecuted Christians to show the Romans that he was tough and he wasn't going to let these rabble rousers, do all this stuff. And then he even would light Christians on, crosses and burn them.
Right, use them to light the streets at night.
Right. Well, he had like circuses and festivals. There'd be people around having a party with burning Christians laying the way. And oh my golly. Well, anyway, you can see how somebody like that would be portrayed as pretty much the embodiment of Satan himself. And that's a kind of character that's portrayed there as the beast in Revelation. Now,
right.
The symbolism points to him. Yeah, so what I was going to say was, even though centuries later, like people forget all about Nero, so Protestants look back and say, "Oh, it points to Rome." So it's the Pope, it's the Catholic Church. So that's what like Luther tried to do, and Protestants have been doing that for years now, and say, "Oh, well, see, it was the Pope. It's pointing to the Pope." Well, it's pointing to Rome and the Roman Emperor, who at the time, it wasn't the Pope.
Well, I might actually agree that the Pope sort of fits the bill for the Antichrist, because I would distinguish the beast from the Antichrist in Revelation.
Well,
right, so the beast is the Roman Emperor.
Well, there's the beast and the false prophet.
Right.
Right. The Antichrist is the beast, who's the political leader, but there's also a false prophet. And I would say the same thing. Like a false prophet would be this like religious leader who would mislead.
Yeah, who claims the Christian label.
Right.
But aligns it with the beast.
Yeah. Although, that remains to be seen, though. But that is another distinctively Christian interpretation, in my opinion, that might be a little bit misplaced, because if it was about convincing Jewish people that this new leader was the Messiah, would that not make more sense if the false prophet were a rabbi, more so than a Christian leader? I don't know.
Well, but you do have like the Jewish leadership sort of capitulating to Roman rule.
Yeah, that's true.
And the alignment of the messianic religion with the beast. So like the beast calls back to the Old Testament serpent, and the serpent is oftentimes a symbol of like Babylon or Persia or something like that.
Right.
So I think there's interesting like ideas about the Antichrist sort of being this person who takes Christianity, claiming to be the returned Messiah.
Right.
But then aligning itself with the beast, which is Rome.
Right.
Which I think is a good prediction of history. When you look at Christian history, I would assign that role to certain individuals in history.
And there have been
particularly Constantine.
Yeah.
That the alignment of a sort of originally radical religion with a conservative, in the sense of like preserving its own existence, its own status quo, that the alignment of a radical religion with status quo power structures is sort of the shape of history and how all this evil happens.
Yes. Yeah, the sad thing about all this is that the language of the book is so symbolic that, I mean, you could interpret it 1,000 different ways. Like it'd be like taking, the movie "It's a Wonderful Life." Who's that really about? Well, I knew a guy like that, and he didn't get to do his childhood dreams, and whatever. Maybe it's about him, or it's like so open. It could apply to a lot of people, and my golly, and they get into this stuff where like, and then this is where they drag it. So I think some of these dispensationalists, the reason they drag the Old Testament prophets in is because then you have more symbolism that you can throw in there. So they'll talk about the big bear from the north. So that must be Russia, and and
well,
so,
yeah, I think there's certain limitations to interpreting specific symbols in terms of like modern day.
Oh, right.
Like, I don't think there's any direct correlations to anything in the modern day. However, I think the question for me is the dispensationalist interpretation of history the same interpretation of like the lens of interpreting history, the same paradigm for historical interpretation as the biblical author of Revelation?
So are you asking, was the author of the Apocalypse a dispensationalist?
Or do the dispensationalists use the lens that is given to them in Revelation or in any New Testament apocalyptic writing accurately?
Oh, no.
Right. So that...
No, I don't. I would not say that.
And then the next question for me is, what is the lens of history that these people are using?
Yeah.
Which is sort of where I was going with, like, I think what John is tapping into is that history is sort of driven by the conflict between the powerful and the weak.
Yeah. Say more about that.
So,
I mean, I get that, but go ahead, tease that out a little more.
Yeah, I would have to go into like specific. I don't know how deep we want to get into like reading the book of Revelation and just going, piece by piece and breaking that down. But in my opinion, the dispensationalists tend to view these events as inevitable. And because they're inevitable, they're part of God's plan. They're good.
Oh,
and I think that the writer of Revelation is not saying that. But not that they're not inevitable, but that they're not part of God's plan necessarily. That the Antichrist is not like a good thing to happen. That the alignment of Christianity with the dominant power structures of society is not something Christians should be looking forward to.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember though. Didn't in the Gospels, doesn't Jesus say something about who was it that would have to be revealed first before he would return, like the son of perdition or something like that? It was some kind of a vague term. I'm trying to remember that just maybe I hadn't thought about that.
Oh yeah, the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians.
That's it. It's in 2 Thessalonians with the...
Yeah, it says, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers and sisters, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by the teaching allegedly from us, whether by a prophecy or by word of mouth or by letter, asserting that the day of the Lord has already come. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction.
Yeah, that's it.
He will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God.
Okay, so that's Paul's addition to it. That wasn't something Jesus himself said, but that's what I was remembering. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I don't know. It does seem to me that there's like a certain tension. I don't want to say we're getting. It's like in some respects, like Paul's commentary there in 2 Thessalonians seems to agree with the Gospels in some way, and then Revelation in other ways.
Well, I think it'd be hard to interpret the man of lawlessness as anybody other than the Roman emperor.
Yeah.
Right? The man of lawlessness, the only person who's not under the law in Rome is the emperor. He sets himself up in God's temple and proclaims himself to be God. That's what the emperors did.
Yeah, and that also may be, okay, so this may also be a reference back to like an expectation of a repeating of history with the Maccabean revolt under Antiochus IV. Because,
well, yeah, I think that's part of the argument I'm making is that this is a pattern in history that these authors are recognizing. And I think that it's a valid pattern.
Oh, yeah. 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 You get, eventually.
And we can harken back to our civil religion episode and talk about how the United States government has set up its own God, its own rationalist God. But I think there is some interesting correlations there. And I think you can see that throughout the rest of history, that this combination of religion and state power, that the marriage of power and authority to religion is sort of what these authors are talking about.
Right. Yeah, it's there's so much there. I mean, it does seem to me it's pretty obvious that this is written. The Revelation of John is written in a period where, in early Christianity, before the merging of church and state. So, you're not going to get this kind of interpretation after Christianity gets protected status in the Roman Empire. So it's before. And so the state, it's like, who is Lord, Jesus or Caesar?
Right. Well, it's interesting that these sorts of interpretations come back in the separation of church and state in America.
Right. Yeah, and then the same people who are embracing these doctrines are the ones who are willing to throw democracy under the bus. At least they have. I've seen them on. I don't know how many, but this whole Christian nationalist movement we talked about before, and it
aligns itself with Trump, who is sort of perceived as this second Messiah for some reason.
Like an antichrist figure. I don't know.
And he's not called I haven't heard him called the Antichrist by anybody that's against him.
I came across a YouTube video a week or two ago where somebody's now doing YouTube videos claiming that Trump's the Antichrist.
Well, if the Antichrist isn't a specific individual, but rather anyone who uses religion or God to align themselves with the power of the state.
So that brings me to another thread of things that were going on in the 1800s. Okay? This was somewhat frontier, but also like even back in the Northeast, like in Pennsylvania. Okay, what was called the Restorationist movement. Mm-hmm. So you had like the ones that became the Disciples of Christ, the Christian Church, under, say, Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone. These folks wanted to do away with denominationalism. And so, like, even the Church of God that's headquartered in Anderson, Indiana, not to be confused with the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, which is a Pentecostal group. Okay. But the Church of God, Anderson, Indiana, they are kind of semi in the holiness tradition, semi in the restorationist tradition, because their eschatology was amillennialist. And so D.S. Warner, I mentioned this before, but interpreted like Revelation as covering the events of all church history between Jesus' first and second comings. And so you had these different kinds of interpretations. It really, I guess it depends on, it seems to me that the revelation of John basically gives people enough symbolism that you can demonize whomever you want to demonize, if I can say it that way.
You said a term, amillennialist.
Yes.
I think it would be good to go into the post, pre, and millennialist.
Oh, okay.
I think a lot of people aren't familiar with that terminology.
Okay, so millennialism is the notion that in the book of Revelation, after the Antichrist turns on the Jews and tries, after he deceives the Jews, tries to destroy them, Jesus shows up with an army out of heaven, comes down on a white horse, and there's the Battle of Armageddon. It's a big bloodbath, but then Jesus establishes his throne, and he reigns on earth for 1,000 years, is what it says. Now, millennialists are those that believe that will literally be a 1,000-year reign, that Jesus will come to earth, and for 1,000 years, there's going to be life on earth with Jesus ruling the world. Okay? Then, opposed to that view are what we call amillennialists, that there is no literal millennium, that the term millennium is symbolic. 1,000 years just is symbolic of like completion of an era, or whatever that means. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the amillennialists are those that do believe that there is no millennium. Millennialist. Okay,
just like theist and atheist.
Theist, someone who does not believe in God, that there's a God. Mm-hmm. And that's different than somebody that believes that there's no God, but nevertheless, that's another. That's a debate where,
right? Yes.
The atheists claim that agnostics are atheists, but just don't want to use the word. And anyway, but it means they're not millennialists. They don't believe in a millennium. So these things all have to be interpreted symbolically. The millennialists, because they believe in a literal millennium, tend to then also believe that the periods of time mentioned in the book of Revelation are literal times. Now, what kind of times? Well, okay, so before getting it back into that, then amongst the millennialists, the question is, there is a millennium, but when does Jesus come back? Now, here's the thing. Predominantly, it does seem to depict Jesus comes back and then he reigns for 1,000 years. But there have been a few times in history, in Western history, where Christianity was spreading so rapidly that some people actually adjusted their eschatology to fit their revivalism. And they believed that they might usher in the millennium, like they would eventually win the world to Christ. And once the entire world became Christian, then Jesus would come down. Like they basically would bring in the millennium, and then Jesus would reign. Like, so Jesus comes back to earth at the end of this, but he's reigned over the earth spiritually for 1,000 years because the entire world has been won to Christ. Okay. There was that, we used to, most of you will not know this song, but when I was a kid, there used to be a song in most hymnals that we would sing at missionary services. It was, "We have a story to tell to the nations." Have you ever heard this? Have you ever heard this one, Isaac?
No, I haven't.
Oh, okay. So we have a story to tell to the nations that will turn their hearts to the right. A story of truth and mercy, or peace and mercy, a story of truth and light, something like that. But the chorus says, "For the darkness shall turn to dawning, and the dawning to noonday bright, and Christ's great kingdom shall come to earth, the kingdom of love and light." And we used to sing that even though the pastors were all preaching premillennial dispensationalism. We're singing this post-millennialist song in church. Premillennialism is the people that expect Jesus is going to come back to earth and then reign for 1,000 years. And usually with that goes the belief that there's going to be, Jesus is coming in two stages. He first appears in the clouds and then takes the Christians up. Okay.
Right.
And removes
it's sort of
them
the
from the
classic,
earth.
like,
What's that?
Dispensationalist.
Yes. That's the classic. And why? Because, see, then there's a different dispensation. So now that the Christians are taken out, then God can really, pour out the vials of wrath and everything and let everybody else on earth have it for not believing in Jesus. And that's kind of the way it's depicted. It's like the people that are like the Gentiles that are stuck on earth after the rapture really have no hope unless for some reason you're so determined that you are martyred for your faith. And that's just because when the one seal is opened, that shows like there's a whole bunch of people that have been martyred. Okay. Now, again, dispensationalists want to make that this is going to be something at the end of time, whenever the Antichrist comes to rule, and then the only people that are going to be saved after the Christians are taken out are going to be the ones that have to be executed for their faith. But it's pretty obvious that the author is already looking back at early Christian martyrdom in the first century or two. Okay, and it sees, and it's like heaven notices and knows about all these who have given their lives for the cause of Christ, etc., etc. Okay,
right.
But that's the difference. There are some people that now also claim like mid-tribulation. So like they'll say you have premillennialist, postmillennialist. That has to do with whether Jesus comes before a literal millennium or after a literal millennium is kind of ushered in through revival. Okay? And then you have amillennialists who don't believe in a millennium. Now, then typically amongst the premillennialist, then you have people that they all believe in a rapture, but when's that rapture going to take place? So then they call them pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib. Okay.
Oh, right. Yeah.
You forgot about that, huh?
You gotta name every ideology.
Oh my golly.
Right?
So it's like
everything's an ism.
Yeah. It's like ordering your value meal at the fast food restaurant or whatever.
Goodness
so
gracious.
I'm a 3A or a 3B. So anyway, those have to do with when's the rapture going to take place. So that's the burning question for all these Darbyites and people. It's like, okay, we don't have to go through the bad stuff.
Now, so I'm curious what your opinion is on this. What effect do those doctrines have on the ethics of their adherents?
Oh.
Like, how do you think about ethics in the worldview of history is sort of out of our hands?
Yeah.
Right? Because that's where I think this is really interesting to people. And that's where I have issues with this like sort of fundamentalist take on the apocalypse, is that it removes ethical responsibility from anybody.
Yeah. Do you ever watch, did I mention this before? Do you ever see the old black and white Twilight Zone episodes?
Oh, yeah. I love those episodes.
Okay. So did you ever see the one where Russell Johnson, the guy who played the professor on Gilligan's Island, he like went back 100 years and on the night that Lincoln was going to be shot, and then he was trying to tell them Lincoln was going to be assassinated, and nobody would believe him except for like this police sergeant or whatever. And because when he returns back to the present, here this police sergeant, because he tried to stop Lincoln's assassination, he became famous and ran for office and was a wheeler and dealer in real estate and stuff and became rich. And when he goes back to the club, like the social club where he was at, the doorman and the chairman of the board had switched places. The guy that when he left, because of him, that was the only thing he could change. Like the whole lesson of the episode was like, some things are set in stone, like Lincoln was going to be shot one way or another, but he did change like the outcomes for these two guys because of influencing their ancestors.
Right.
Yeah, so back to your question. It'd be like somebody saying, okay, what if one of the other disciples overheard Judas conspiring to betray Jesus, but then knew, like in other words, that this had to happen for Jesus to suppose somebody that knew, like this is what had to happen.
There's something interesting there because Jesus tells Judas,
yeah,
you're going to betray me before Judas intends to do so.
Yeah. And he says, what you're going to do it quickly. And to me, that's almost like him saying, okay, you've made up your mind, do it before you change your mind. But that's also that's why I tend to lean towards the interpretation that Judas did this in ignorance, thinking that he was forcing Jesus' hand to start the revolution. Because Judas
I find that
right.
rather compelling.
Yes.
As an interpretation, that Judas is not an intentional traitor.
No. He was, so I'm not sure about Dante's interpretation there of Judas being in the lowest hell with Brutus and other traitors. But it seemed, because whenever Judas sees what happens, he goes out and hangs himself. Now, if he really intended and thought Jesus was a false Messiah and needed to be, put to death or whatever, he wouldn't have hung himself.
Well, I heard an interpretation of this, that if you were sitting at the table with Jesus as one of his disciples, and you heard him say, one of you will betray me, you would think, well, maybe he's trying to get one of us to betray him.
Right. Right. And he even, it's the one I'm going to dip the sop or whatever, does the fondue and hands it to Judas.
So you can sort of interpret Judas as the most obedient of the disciples, and the only disciple who never sees Jesus resurrected.
Yeah, well, that's true. It sounds like you've been reading the Gospel of Judas. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not, actually.
Oh, really? So the Gospel of Judas, and it was one that we discovered. It came to light. It came back out in the public here. Just in the last 25 years ago, or whatever. I can't remember, but it had been recovered later. But the Gospel of Judas basically tells the story that after a certain point in time, Jesus realized that he was wrong about him being the Messiah. He was mistaken. And he decides and conspires with Judas that if he's going to end up being taken by the authorities anyway, he wants to go out in a blaze of glory. And so he conspires. The only one he can really trust is Judas. And so he conspires with Judas to betray him, to turn him over so he can at least go out a martyr. It's obvious why that was never canonized in Christian scriptures.
It's interesting, though.
Yeah, because Judas gets increasingly evil over time as you go from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John. Early on, it's just he's a little greedy. They offered him some money. And then later, it's like he was okay in the beginning, but then Satan entered his heart at a certain point, and then he betrays him. And then by the time you get to John, it's like Jesus says he knew he was a devil from the beginning, but he picked him because he needed a traitor.
Well, that goes back to the sort of interpretation of Judas is sort of doomed.
Yeah.
From an ethical standpoint. He never really gets to choose.
Well, and this is what has fueled, so I'll admit it, there's places in the book of Romans where, it does seem to me that Paul leans pretty heavily into predestinationism and a pretty heavy fatalism. I don't necessarily, for me, I don't know that makes me feel compelled because of other things that he says. And
he also talks about the importance of freedom and
right.
He sort of tears down the idea of moral laws for the sake of free choice.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I personally think a proper reading of Paul is that there are big events that are going to take place regardless of how the details work out. There's a certain flow or course of events of major things that are going to happen. But I don't know that means that every little detail is kind of worked out and that things can't be shifted around. And so, but people want to buy into this fatalism when it takes them off the hook. See? So back to your original question. When somebody's convinced that, it's got to get worse before Jesus can come back. it's like, oh, well, if we're destroying the earth with global warming, we're just bringing Jesus a little closer. I mean, really, is that a risk you really want to take? I mean, seriously, like I can't see, for example, in the Gospels, Jesus saying, "Oh yeah, it's too bad you're blind, but hang in there. I am coming back here eventually. I'll take care of that then. It's got to get worse before it's going to get better." I don't see Jesus embracing that kind of a worldview, but that seems to be what people want to take away from it. Like it's a convenient excuse to say, "Oh well, it's got to get worse. It's got to." So, to me, back to your question about the ethics of this, it completely jumps over like the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is saying, be salt and light in a world. Like where this is part of the whole social gospel movement. And this is what created the social gospel movement. All of this kind of dispensationalism and separatism. It's like, oh, well, we'll just stick our fingers in our ears and wait for Jesus to come back. And then you had people like Rauschenbusch saying, okay, enough is enough. I mean, how much suffering do people have to go through before Christians are going to do anything about it?
Well, that's an interesting connection because you have this doctrine sort of appeals to the poor and the powerless,
right,
who never really get to make a choice anyway because of the way our social economy is set up.
Right.
But then you also have liberation theology come straight out of that same context.
Exactly.
Which is almost the exact opposite.
Yeah. Yeah. I really think a lot of this has to do with, politics, economics. It really comes about with the way the economies develop and the timing of that. I venture to say that we're going to see this emerge, same kind of thoughts and dynamics emerge in other parts of the world where economies are still growing and developing, to where you get it has to get to the point where people are able to make a better life for themselves instead of just struggling to get by and doing without basic things like healthcare and such. And you might say that even in the industrialized world, there's still a lot of people, let's put it this way, okay, yeah, we'll give you antibiotics, but we don't want to pay for your chemo treatments. I mean, anyway, that's another discussion for another day. But
I think it's important to sort of note that one of the sort of interpretations of our ethical responsibility serves to maintain the status quo, and the other one serves to upset the status quo.
Yes.
When it comes to this apocalypticism.
Yeah. So
like one says
say more
don't
about
do
that
anything.
Just for a second. Go ahead.
So the dispensationalist, premillennialist, rapture theology people, they are, if you're a poor person as part of one of those traditions, there's not a lot of ideological incentive for you to try and better your position. There's not a lot of incentive for you to like care about your wage or unionization or political action or any of that stuff. You're not going to be worried about climate change. You're not going to be worried about, the wars going on because it's all sort of out of your hands anyway.
Well, and what's really amazing, and I don't mean amazing in the sense that it's not understandable. It is, but it's amazing to me that people will carry things to this point. A significant number of these folks who think this way also refuse to admit that climate change is man-made.
Right.
It's caused by human activity. They want to think that, no, this is just part of, God's controlling the environment. And so it just, it's something we don't have to worry about.
Yeah, I wonder if that's an expression of some like unspoken doubt as to their worldview. They're like, well, this is just natural. We don't have to really worry about this because if we're wrong about our worldview, then this is actually the end of the world for our children.
Well, I guess that's possible. That's possible. I don't really think these folks really anticipate that there is a danger.
Well, and I think it's interesting that these are the same folks who, when it comes to like political action and their responsibility for it, are set, they're sort of brainwashed into maintaining the status quo by inaction. And these are the same folks who want, they're the same folks who are on the street saying like, well, this nation needs a dictator like Trump.
Yeah.
Right? Because they don't want to have to do any political action on their own part. So they just want a king.
Yeah. Yeah. Another part of this is, I think, this kind of doctrine allows lower and middle class people to act like spoiled rich kids. In other words, I don't have to worry about, like, God's my father and he's rich, and I've heard people talk this way. I don't worry about it. Jesus said to take no thought for tomorrow. So it's like, yeah, but what if it's messes we're causing? That's why they don't want to accept that we're causing it, because then I have a responsibility to do something about it.
Right.
If, they don't want to think like, maybe I should, buy a smaller vehicle or try to get a hybrid or electric vehicle or do something, whatever.
Yeah, it all kind of comes back to that ideology helps you escape from ultimate concern.
And
from like anxiety.
Yeah, responsibility. Yeah. Exactly. Well, anyway. And I'll say this. Okay, so for those of you who think I'm being a little, or we are being a little too cynical here, I'll say this. This kind of viewpoint wasn't even espoused by Jesus, because, remember, Jesus said, the one who's going to be judged when I do return is going to be the one who's not doing anything.
Right.
The person who is abusing their fellow servant. The person who is being slothful and hiding
the person that buries the talent.
Exactly right. So the people, when Jesus returns, he expects us to be doing something about the problems that are in the world.
Yep.
Anyway, there's my sermon for the day.
I'll go out on this point. Have you ever heard of the rap group Arrested Development?
I've heard the name, but no.
So they do a lot of very good songs about religion.
TV show, Arrested Development, or something like that?
There is, but it's not related.
Oh, okay.
This is a totally different group.
Okay.
So they do a lot of songs about like politics and religion and civil rights and revolution and stuff like that. So they have a song called "Fishin' for Religion." I'd like to read some lyrics from it.
Okay.
I think it's a good way to go out here.
All right.
Sitting in church hearing legitimate woes. Pastor tells the lady it'll be all right. Just pray so you can see the pearly gates so white. The lady prays and 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 prays. It's everlasting. There's nothing wrong with praying. It's what she's asking. She's asking the Lord to let her cope. So one day she can see the golden ropes. What you pray for, God will give. To be able to cope in this world we live. The word cope and the word change are directly opposite, not the same. She should have been praying to change her woes, but the pastor said, pray to cope with those.
Wow.
It's a good song.
Yeah, that's pretty heavy stuff. Well, that's good. Yeah, that's a good note. Just because we anticipate the possibility of some sort of apocalyptic events in our lifetimes doesn't mean that we have to just sit by idly and do nothing about it. We all have the ability to be changers and movers, and that's what we should aspire to do. Let's do our best to brighten the corner of the world in which we live, bring the kingdom of God a little closer, however you want to frame it. But we should do our part to advance things for all of us. Any last words, Isaac, before we sign off here today?
I don't think so.
Okay, well, we have enjoyed this. I hope you have too. And we hope that at least your day-to-day life is not apocalyptic, and you're enjoying life and taking care of yourself. So do that, and you'll hear again from us real soon. We look forward to spending more time with you. Reach out to us at thehappycynics@gmail.com, and we appreciate you listening. Have a good day.